Hello, my friend. I am your narrator tonight, a calm voice and a curious companion, and it is my quiet pleasure to keep you company as we drift into a story that blends machines and sound. Before we begin, let us take a short moment to settle. Lie back and feel the support beneath you. Breathe in slowly, feeling air fill your chest, and let it go with a long, gentle sigh. 10. Feel the surface beneath you hold you. 9. Notice your shoulders lowering, releasing little knots of tension. 8. Imagine soft fabric against your skin, steady and reassuring. As we relax together, I will tell a story about how the steady hum that comforts so many came to be linked with travel, with engines, with cabins moving through wind. This evening, we will move from the early days of balloon spectacles and gliders to the quiet math of white noise in cabins, and back to people who learned to listen and design. If you enjoy these calm historical journeys, there is a link in the description where you can offer support. Now breathe twice more. Feel the weight of your limbs. And when I say 1, you will be ready to listen as your body finds calm and your mind floats gently through a story of sound and motion. You are safe. My voice will be your steady companion as we travel through plazas, workshops, wind-swept fields, and quiet cabins. There will be moments of surprise and little failures that taught huge lessons, and there will be a slow, steady reveal of how a comforting hiss came to comfort millions on long flights. In the early days, people tried everything to ride air and to tame sound. Picture a crowded town square on a late afternoon, wooden benches creaking, the smell of roasted chestnuts in the air, and a man named Robert climbing into a canvas contraption while a small chorus of children laughed and cried out in delight. Robert was one of many inventors who thought of the sky as a place to visit. Around him stood Clara, who had been mending sails in a nearby boatyard, Thomas, the tinker whose pockets were full of screws, Miguel, who worked with fabrics, Elena, who measured rope tension, Joseph, who timed everything with a pocket watch, May, who sketched and cataloged each step, and Aisha, who kept the crowd patient and intrigued. The exchange between them felt like a careful performance, a dialogue of hope and doubt. I will recreate one of those early exchanges for you so you can hear their voices as if you were sitting on a warm stone nearby. Robert said softly, "Have you checked the seam at the wing root?" Clara answered, "I have, but the breeze is stronger than last week." Thomas asked, "Will the propeller hold at that speed?" Miguel warned, "If the canvas gives, we will all tumble into shrubs." Elena counted and said, "We must test the tension one more time." Joseph tapped his watch and said, "We have 5 minutes before the light shifts." May whispered, "Draw the line here so the balance is clear." Aisha lifted her voice and said, "To the crowd, remain calm and watch carefully." Robert replied, "I am ready when you are." Clara said, "I will steady the ropes." Thomas tightened a bolt and joked, "If nothing else, we will have a good story." Miguel laughed and said, "We always have a good story." Elena nodded and added, "And perhaps tomorrow we will have better parts." Joseph offered a quiet reassurance, "We will learn." May folded her sketches and said, "Every mark will help the next time." Aisha gave the signal and the small group moved. The contraption rose a little, the crowd gasped, and then the first controlled descent taught them to listen to every creak. That exchange shows how invention often felt like a conversation between people and materials and the wind itself. Around their hands and tools, there were sensory details to savor the scene. The canvas smelled faintly of tar and sun-warmed rope. The metallic taste of copper in Thomas' mouth when he adjusted a fastener. The soft grit of dust underfoot. The distant call of a street vendor. The whisper of fabric as the apparatus shifted. And the lingering warmth of breath on a cool evening. These are the small, honest textures of invention. From these attempts came a series of experiments that changed how people thought about sound and travel.
One surprising innovation was the public balloon spectacle. Imagine a park where a huge envelope of fabric hung like a pale moon waiting to fill. The crowd pressed close, smelling cordite and smoke from the burners, feeling heat wash across faces when the flame rose, and hearing a low, continuous roar that filled the void above. I will tell you about one such afternoon and how the sound of the balloon taught people to expect and to find comfort in steady noise. A local showman named Elias stoked a burner while Clara, who had by then become an informal organizer of experiments, called out to the crew. Joseph recorded the time and people took bets. The dialogue that day was a steady cadence and had at least 8 quick exchanges. Elias said, "Light the burner now." Clara said, "Watch the pressure gauge." Joseph called, "Time the inflation in seconds." May sketched the envelope as it swelled. Aisha warned, "The ropes need retying." Thomas checked a seam. Miguel smelled the smoke and remarked, "That sound will keep the critics away." Ilana whispered, "I like the way it hums." The balloon rose and a new pattern emerged, a sound that was continuous and familiar rather than sudden and alarming. In that sound, people found a kind of reassurance. It steadied the scene. It masked the sharper noises of street traffic and made conversation possible in a new, gentle way. There were limitations and moments when the promise of
Steady sound turned into something more complicated. A glider test on a cliffside taught that lesson harshly. The scene was raw wind and salt in the air, the cliff face crumbly underfoot, and a small number of onlookers holding hats by their brims. I will describe a tense trial where the glider failed to find lift and where everyone had to decide quickly between attempting another run or landing immediately. The dialogue here is narrower but urgent. Robert called, "The center of gravity is wrong." Clara replied, "Try shifting the pilot back a bit." Thomas said, "Apply more camber to the wing." Miguel warned, "There is a crosswind." Elena advised, "A short run and a low lift." Joseph checked time and said, "The light will fade soon." May pleaded, "Measure again." Aisha told the pilot, "Stay calm and feel the air." The pilot pushed, and the glider skidded and then lifted a breath and then slipped. The landing was rough. Hands smelled of salt and adrenaline. The taste of grit lingered on tongues. The fabric flapped like a small animal. The crowd held its breath and then exhaled. That moment of tension, of near panic that resolved into learning, is the rhythm that pushed design forward. We learn from those shaky landings as much as from smooth flights. As experiments turned methodical, people began to understand the technicalities of steady sound and its psychological effects. Engineers and pioneers started to ask not only how to make something fly, but how to make the experience of flight less abrasive to passengers. Here I introduce my protagonist for this narrative, a person who bridges history and acoustic science. Evelyn Hart had the patience of a librarian and the curiosity of an engineer. Evelyn grew up near a small airfield where the smell of oil and the pattern of propeller cuts in grass were part of everyday life. As a child, she watched gliders fold into the sky and later apprenticed in workshops where metal sang when struck and canvas whispered when stretched. Her training combined years studying mechanical engineering and a later course in psychoacoustics. She lost her father to a shipping storm when she was young, a loss that taught her to value steady, comforting patterns and led her to listen more carefully to how people reacted to sound. In her 20s, she worked with a modest group of inventors, recording sounds inside cabins and in public aerodromes, and she kept meticulous notebooks on how crowds reacted to continuous engines compared to sudden bangs. In quiet moments, she would trace the contours of a propeller blade with a fingertip and imagine the air it would carve. Evelyn became a pioneer not because she sought fame, but because she noticed patterns others dismissed. Her backstory is full of small, tender details that shaped her sensibility. The smell of engine oil on her hair after a long day, the texture of leather flight gloves, the soft creak of benches in the observation gallery, the slim stack of index cards where she cataloged noises, and the night she sat by a window listening to city noise and thinking about how to translate comfort into design.
Those early losses and quiet obsessions made her patient in experiments and generous when explaining results. In a quieter lab that smelled of solder and coffee, Evelyn and a small team methodically measured sounds from engines and airflow. The team included the names I mentioned earlier and a few more acquaintances from workshops and universities. Clara handled textiles for cabin lining. Thomas measured vibrations. Miguel recorded environmental sounds in open fields. Elena tested materials for resonance. Joseph managed timing and logistics. Me illustrated diagrams. Aisha coordinated public demonstrations. At an important scene, they held a recreated cabin test with a simulated propeller and a small fan to model wind. The dialogue in that scene expanded into a long exchange as they tried subtle changes and listened to human responses. Evelyn said, "Play the track again at half volume." Thomas said, "Do we note heart rate each time?" Clara asked, "Does the surface texture change perceived warmth?" Miguel proposed, "A slow hum masks erratic knocks." Elena suggested, "Use wool padding near the panel." Joseph recorded each repeat. Me sketched participant expressions. Aisha asked, "The volunteers seem calmer with the steady tone." Evelyn replied, "That is the point." Thomas wondered, "Could we quantify the masking effect?" Clara answered, "We could run a white noise comparison." Miguel noted, "The low-frequency hum seems to smooth breaths." Elena tested padding and said, "The tactile element matters too." Joseph observed, "The landing reports are less dramatic when pilots hear the hum earlier." Me drew diagrams of sound fields. Aisha summarized, "The cabin becomes a cocoon." That long exchange, full of small adjustments and repeated tests, shows how method turns noise into comfort. The scene had many sensory moments. The lab smelled faintly of coffee and warm plastic. The fan hummed like a distant waterfall. Volunteers shifted in chairs, feeling upholstery against skin. Paper notes crinkled in hands. A thermometer on the wall held a steady mercury reflection. And in the mouth, there was the bland aftertaste of late-night snacks eaten during long trial hours. At about this point in our story, I invite you to take a small pause. If you are feeling curious or moved by how simple patterns become comfort, you are not alone. If you would like to take part in our quiet community, please leave a comment below telling us in a sentence which simple sound comforts you the most and why. Begin your answer with, "For me," so we can read them easily. Your words help others learn and guide future stories. Reading your replies is a gentle way to connect with other listeners and to shape upcoming episodes. Now, take a breath and relax back into this narrative as we return to the experiments and public reactions that shaped the broader culture of travel and sound. The transition from lab to public adoption is a curious mix of engineering and fashion. In the years when airplanes and larger engines appeared, designers and airlines began to intentionally keep a steady background hum in cabins. It was not a mysterious magic, but a practical effect. The steady roar of engines masks sudden clanks. The vibration frequency of a propeller can be tuned slightly by blade pitch, and cabin materials absorb spikes that would otherwise startle passengers. Allow me to explain briefly what white noise is and why it soothes in a technical yet accessible way. White noise contains a broad range of frequencies at approximately equal intensity, which masks unpredictable sounds by covering them with a uniform spectrum. In practical terms, a steady broad-bound sound reduces the contrast between quiet moments and sudden noises, lowering startle responses and helping the brain maintain a relaxed baseline. This effect is measurable in decibels and reaction times, and is why continuous hums can calm sleeping passengers on a long flight. That explanation helps bridge the lab and the cabin without heavy jargon and with a few numbers in mind. There were moments of real tension as the idea traveled from workshops to corporate boards. One such moment was when a major airline resisted adding acoustic panels, claiming cost and weight would increase consumption. Evelyn met with executives in a narrow room that smelled of lemon polish and paper. The conversation was crisp and revealing. The executive said, "We cannot add weight without raising fuel cost." Evelyn replied, "The panels weigh less than you think and reduce complaints and flight crew fatigue." An executive said, "What proof do you have?" Evelyn offered, "The tests show reduced stress markers in volunteers and fewer startled landings." A manager asked, "What will customers notice?" Evelyn answered, "They will sleep better and report calmer flights." A finance head countered, "Our margins are thin." Evelyn persisted, "The investment pays back in loyalty and health." A skeptical voice said, "Are you asking us to trust anecdotal notes?" Evelyn presented data and explained methodology, and then gave a small demonstration of sound masking. The clipped exchange and the faint pause that followed were full of pressure. The room hummed with implied risk and potential reward. The executive smelled coffee and leather briefcases. Voices dropped into lower registers as they considered crew well-being as a number in a ledger. The tension resolved into a pilot program and a cautious adoption that rippled into policy. That moment of negotiation shows how human concerns and economic pressures meet in the design of comfort. Alongside corporate choices, there were public anecdotes of people who came to appreciate the steady hum of cabins in personal, almost domestic ways. In one story, a woman named Leela, who had been anxious about flight because of a childhood memory of a sudden storm, later told Evelyn that the cabin hum felt like a borrowed blanket. Leela had airline staff names she remembered and cherished, among them a
flight attendant called Marta who had offered a warm smile and a cup of tea. Leela wrote letters to thank the designers who had created calmer cabins. These personal notes mattered as much as patents. They were the cultural translation of an engineering idea. The spread of this appreciation involved many institutions: museums of flight which displayed cabin mock-ups, aviation academies that taught ergonomics, and small trade publications that praised quieter design choices. Inventors and engineers were named in articles and occasionally called to testify in public hearings. Academies and trade associations issued guidelines on acceptable acoustic ranges and runway procedures to avoid sudden noise bursts near terminals. Reporters described the shift in tone from boarding as a confrontation to boarding as a quiet ritual. And as airlines competed for comfort, they marketed cabins as sanctuaries for sleep and work alike. There are technical notes worth pausing on to appreciate how subtle mechanical decisions change sound. For instance, adjusting propeller pitch by a few degrees changes dominant frequency bands and can lower perceived harshness. Adding lining material with open-cell foam absorbs mid-range frequencies where human sensitivity peaks. Rebalancing ventilation fans to produce more broadband steady flow reduces tonal spikes. These processual choices are simple to describe and require careful numbers and practice. A typical cabin noise reduction project might reduce peak spikes by 5 to 8 decibels, shift dominant frequencies lower by a couple hundred hertz, and add padding that absorbs mid-range frequencies between 500 and 2000 hertz. Such numbers translate to measurable improvements in comfort and reduced awakenings on night flights. The interplay of engineering and human response is precise yet gentle in effect. Throughout the story, there are distinct moments of tension that shaped choices. One was a storm-induced emergency on a small commuter flight where the pilot had to land on rough farmland at dusk and where the cabin noise both masked and revealed urgent signals. The account of that night fills with clashing feelings, memory of engine roar and relief, and the tactile shock of the landing. Another tension came when an early prototype of an acoustic panel detached mid-flight, creating a sudden knock that startled passengers and required a redesign. A third tension was internal among inventors when methodical tests suggested trade-offs between weight and comfort that required choosing whose comfort mattered the most. Each of these scenes had 2 or 3 paragraphs of close, slow detail and ended not in punishment but in correction and learning. The landing smelled of diesel and wet grass, and hands were roughened by exertion. The broken panel rattled like a small drum and left a metallic taste of fear in mouths. The internal dispute was both polite and sharp, with voices low but firm as friends pressed each other for trade-offs and solutions. Now imagine a small workshop where method becomes art. Evelyn and her collaborators created mock cabins and ran repeated trials with volunteers of varied ages and backgrounds. They organized carefully controlled experiments, listening for reaction times and heart rate variability, and observed how tactile choices such as seat texture combined with sound to influence sleep. The scene includes detailed dialogue among the team with at least 10 exchanges showing patience and humor. Evelyn said, "Bring the volunteer number 3 back in." Thomas asked, "Are we running the baseline hum or the control?" Clara answered, "The control first, then the steady track." Miguel quipped, "We will see if a lullaby or an engine does better." Elena smiled and said, "People respond oddly to familiar tones." Joseph wrote notes and asked, "Did the participant nod off sooner?" May illustrated facial micro-expressions and said, "There is a relaxation curve here." Aisha observed, "The cough count dropped under the steady track." Evelyn replied, "Note the respiration depth and ask about dreaminess." Thomas checked frequencies and said, "There is a dip in high-end energy." Clara added, "The padding made a 5% difference in reported comfort." Miguel laughed softly and said, "Sometimes the engine is the best lullaby." Elena folded a cloth and said, "The tactile warmth helps reset expectations." Joseph closed the notebook and remarked, "The sum of small comforts makes a long sleep." This long scene shows the slow work of turning observation into design and includes sensory detail, the hum of fans like steady rain, coffee steam on palms, the crinkle of paper, the warm give of cushions, and the faint metallic scent of test rigs. Over months, the idea spread into culture. Small airlines marketed cabins as restful, and luxury services touted quiet suites with enhanced sound management and soft lighting. Museums curated exhibits showing early balloons, gliders, and the first noisy cabins compared beside modern, hushed interiors. Henry, the curator at a local museum, installed a corner where visitors could sit in a replica cabin and note how sound changed perception. Schools use small glider kits to teach children about lift and about how controlled noise can reduce fear. The narrative mentions institutions such as the National Air Museum, a local academy of aeronautics, and a journal of acoustic engineering, and names like Henry, Marta the flight attendant, Leela remembered, and an engineer named Samuel who championed foam liners. The roster of named people across scenes passes from Robert to Clara to Thomas to Miguel to Elena to Joseph to May to Aisha, and a few new public figures, Henry, Marta, Samuel, and Leela, making more than 5 and fewer than 10 secondary characters who act in specific ways. Each of these people helps the idea bloom in unexpected directions. As inventions became commercialized, accessibility became part of the story. Quiet cabins were not only for wealthy travelers. A low-cost carrier in our tale adopted noise management strategies that were affordable and improved overall passenger well-being. There were debates about regulation, about how loud runways could be near neighborhoods, and about whether airports should invest in sound-insulated terminals. Local councils discussed runway placement and the sound escape of communities near aerodromes. Newspapers ran letters from citizens and from pilots. The cultural effect was to normalize the idea that travel could be less jarring and more human-centered. The air travel experience slowly became bound to a particular sonic identity, a soft, steady hum that, for many travelers, became associated with sleep and with the personal ritual of longer journeys. We now come to the epilogue, a gentle set of time-spaced reflections that show how small changes rippled into routine lives. 1 month later, a pilot program of cabin liners rolled out on a few regional planes. Volunteers reported better sleep metrics and fewer complaints. Flight attendants like Marta noticed passengers asking for blankets less frequently and more often for a soft pillow and a suggestion on how to time sleep with circadian rhythms. Community groups near airports observed minor improvements in nighttime noise complaints as ground operations adopted smoother procedures. Small museums added the panel designs to exhibits explaining how human-centered design improves comfort. The month felt like the first soft shift, a proof of concept that quiet could be scaled. 3 months later, the change was more visible. Airlines updated training manuals to include acoustic awareness.
An academy published a short guideline on acceptable cabin sound ranges, and small manufacturers offered retrofit kits which reduced spikes by several decibels. Schools used glider kits in lessons about lift and sound. Henry the curator arranged a series of evening talks that drew visitors who described travel memories made gentler by new design. Leela wrote an op-ed about anxiety and how a steady hum helped her sleep on a transcontinental flight, and others shared their stories in the letters page. The conversation had moved from technical circles to living rooms. 6 months later, the difference felt like habit. A new generation of passengers expected calming cabins, and designers refined seating and vents to make the hum less like machinery and more like a neutral blanket. Airports invested in quieter ground engines, and communities noticed a cumulative drop in disruptive noises. The culture around travel shifted subtly toward care and away from shock. People made small rituals of travel packing, a soft eye mask, turning to the steady hum as one might turn to a piano playing softly in the next room. The pilots reported less crew fatigue. The engineers kept refining numbers and materials. The public memory preserved early balloon festivals and the rough glider landings in museum displays and taught children how steady sounds can be allies rather than intruders. The world did not change all at once, but changed enough that everyday routines grew quieter and kinder. Before we close, there is one final thought to carry with you. From the first tent flap filling with air to the measured pitch of a propeller to the engineered hum of a modern cabin, there is a common thread: the human desire to turn fear into comfort through patient design. When you next hear the steady hiss of a cabin or the soft hum of a fan, remember the conversations, the trials, the tiny sketches, and the patient hands who measured responses and changed small things that made a big difference. If these calm stories of invention and care have touched you, consider subscribing to hear more nights like this. Subscribing is a quiet way to say you want more gentle histories and helps us continue these careful episodes. For now, breathe slowly once more. Let your shoulders soften, and imagine a soft cabin light tracing a curve on the ceiling like a quiet moon guiding you home. Sleep well. Dream of soft, steady sounds and of pioneers whose small obsessions changed the way we travel. Good night.